Well, good morning and welcome to my Sunday morning coffee with Dr. Childress. Today, I'm going to be discussing the problematic parent, uh, the narcissistic, borderline, dark personality parent. Uh, the just by way of terminology, um, diagnosis means the same thing as identify. Pathology means the same thing as problem, and treatment means the same thing as fix it. So these two sentences mean exactly the same thing. We must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. So you can use those terms interchangeably. So I could equally call this the pathological parent, depending upon whether I want to identify at a professional level the nature of the problem, or in this case, the problematic parent, if I want to de emphasize the professional level of the description and move it more into a useful treatment oriented description of the problem. The with the problematic parent, the pathological parent in the family courts, we do need to identify the nature of the pathology, not with the parent. We can identify the issue is the child's attachment pathology and the cause of that, which is a shared delusion. But we have to understand that this is child psychological abuse because that's going to guide our treatment decision making. So we do need to identify that. In addition, we need to identify it for the child, that the problematic parenting of the pathological parent, that the rest of society views it as sufficiently problematic that we are taking a child protection response. And that helps balance out the delusional disorder. If we don't challenge the delusional disorder, then the child is getting a message from us that that false belief is somehow true. And so that's again why diagnosis is so important. If we're treating a shared delusion, we need to challenge that delusion and provide the child with a normal range perception of reality. So today I'm going to, though, be talking about the problematic parent that we have in the family courts. The This is from Kernberg, and the fundamental issue for the narcissistic and borderline personality pathology is their inability to process sadness and grief. That has to do with the attachment networks. Sadness and grief is processed through the attachment networks. When we get sad, we go get a hug, So it's metabolized through relationship and through the attachment. And when there's trauma in the attachment networks, the person cannot go and access nurture for their grief. They don't know how to regulate sadness. And instead, they get channeled over into anger. And this is a quote from Dr. Kernberg, Otto Kernberg, psychiatrist. He's probably in psychoanalytic world, he's considered the top of personality disorder experts. And he says they, narcissists, are especially deficient in genuine feelings of sadness and mournful longing. Their incapacity for experiencing depressive reactions is a basic feature of their personalities. When abandoned or disappointed by other people, they may show what on the surface looks like depression, but which on further examination emerges as anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes rather than real sadness for the loss of the person whom they appreciated. So that's a fundamental deficit, and that's causally deficit for a lot of the symptoms we see relative to the narcissistic and borderline personality. Is they get locked up around situations of sadness and mourning and grief. They can't do that. Instead, they lash out when they do that. The core issue within them, okay, for them, is the idea that they, or the belief system that they are inadequate, fundamentally broken. That's for the borderline, it gets very overt. They feel that on the surface. The borderline very close is always fighting against this feeling of dropping into the dark abyss of their inadequacy. And so they're struggling to stay out of it. The narcissist has gotten further distance from that black abyss. But at the same, for them, yeah, if you expose their inadequacy, you create the narcissistic injury that gets all the narcissistic rage coming back to try to maintain that sense of self against the collapse. And so the borderline personality is sensitive to rejection. The narcissist is sensitive to abandonment. I mean, the narcissist is sensitive to rejection, and the borderline is sensitive to abandonment. And the divorce creates abandonment and rejection. So that's going to hit spot on to the vulnerability of the pathological parent. So that, but both the narcissist and the borderline are variants of the same type of personality. So Otto Kernberg puts them in the same category, narcissistic borderline personalities. They just have differences in expressing how they're coping with the attachment damage inside. So they believe I am fundamentally inadequate as a person, and as a result, I will be rejected and abandoned because of my inadequacy. And actually, that's a true belief that has some reality base to it. Because look, what you happened in the marriage here. You married them, and then when you found out more about their inadequacy, you rejected them and abandoned them. And so that's a fundamental belief. And because they have the splitting, which is characteristic of both of these, a polarization of thinking, black and white thinking with no middle, extremes with no middle, that's splitting. It's very characteristic of narcissistic and borderline personality. You don't see that splitting symptom anywhere else. You don't see it with ADHD, autism, depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorder. Nowhere else has splitting except the personality disorders, and it has to do with trauma. And it got into the brain networks. So they can't have bonding networks and safety networks on at the same time. It's either going to go one way or the other. Either you're all wonderful or you're all bad. And because of that splitting sides, they believe that the child also has to make that choice between parents. That they cannot. The source of that splitting is the child, the pathological parent as a child, is trying to bond to a parent who is at the same time both a source of danger and a source of nurture. So the source of nurture draws bonding, but the source of danger draws escape. And so they have two conflicting motivations towards that parent. A strong motivation to bond because they're trying to get away from a dangerous situation and get protection from the parent who's the dangerous situation. So they have this motivation to bond, and at the same time a motivation to flee. And so which motivation do they take? And so they go one way or the other, and make a decision on that. The systems do. The borderline makes the decision, or the system makes the decision to continue to try to get love. And so they're trying to bond to a dangerous parent. And that's going to put them on high anxiety because they're open and vulnerable. And if that parent switches to the dangerous parent, there's no defenses there. So the borderline is very sensitive to signals of abandonment, or the rejection, but by the attachment figure. The narcissist makes the other decision, that they choose safety over bonding, which allows them to structure up a little bit higher because they don't have all that anxiety, disorganizing things inside, but then they're empty inside. they've given up love, so there's no love inside, and that's the source of the cruelty. Um, the borderline is chaotic. Their rages are intense, but they're not cruel. They're disorganized. They kind of absorb other people, especially children, but not necessarily in the cruel way that the narcissist is, with the absence of empathy. And that's because of that decision to give up love for safety versus the borderline's choice of continuing to seek love. So there's a little bit more. The treatment prognosis for the borderline spectrum is higher, is better. The other feature I should just say, as I talk about personality pathology, that the research indicates that 70% of women who are diagnosed as borderline were are trauma abuse survivors, and so oftentimes sexually abused. And so it's basically the people we're categorizing as borderline personalities are trauma survivors. They're the survivors of child abuse, and they never told anybody. She never told anybody. She never got treatment. So is it any wonder she's having trouble in the interpersonal relationships and intimacy and dealing with uh, just separation and grief and love and all sorts of things, or emotions, because she never got treatment for the child abuse. And so there's strong consideration about reorganizing our approach to personality disorders away from sort of the categorical definitions and more into understanding the unresolved trauma, because we're double pathologizing that child abuse victim. Not only were they abused as a child, but they never got treatment. So then when they grow up, we give them a label again that you're broken and pathological. And that's what, for the borderlines, that's what makes them afraid to kind of be honest or exposed, because we're going to label them and identify their fundamental inadequacy, and they know because they were abused, and so they know they're broken, and so they kind of spin. Marsha Linehan has done some excellent work with the dialectic behavior therapy of uh, helping that process of healing within that situation. By the way, the term borderline comes from the 1930s, when we first started to kind of get a sense of these characteristic patterns. And it was chosen because there was a belief they were on the borderline of neurotic and psychotic. And so it's we know they collapse into persecutory belief systems and persecutory delusions under stress. Um, that's we know that. We know the narcissist does as well. The so yeah, so what they're part of what they're doing, or one way of looking at what the pathological parent is doing, is they are seeking to restore their narcissistic defense. So when you left them, or the divorce, that was the narcissistic injury to the narcissist. That's the borderline's abandonment. And so they're collapsing, or in the danger of collapsing into that black hole. Plus, when there's a separation of the attachment bond, a breach in the attachment bond, that's going to activate the attachment system and grief and loss. I don't care if you're fighting, I don't care if you're having a hard time. That was still a bonded relationship, and there's grief and loss over that, and the loss over the dreams and everything. And that's a lot of where, if you're seeing a lot of anger from them, that's where it's coming from. It's their grief and loss. It's their sadness translated as anger. And so they have to restore their sense of self, because they're about to collapse into the black hole of painful inadequacy. And so what you're seeing is a defensive attempt to reestablish their self structure, their sense of I'm capable, I'm competent, I'm not the rejected one, you are. I'm not the inadequate one, you are. And so they create, the child is rejecting you for being inadequate. I'm not being rejected as the inadequate spouse. You are. So you're the inadequate parent, your spouse, and you're being rejected because of your inadequacy. And they put it because the divorce puts that on public display, their inadequacy on public display. You said you're so inadequate as a spouse, I'm divorcing you. And everybody knows that they're a failure and they're inadequate. So they need to create this public display of your inadequacy to get it off of them, projected onto you. And then meanwhile, they adopt the role of the all wonderful and ideal parent, that the child is choosing me and rejecting you. So both sides of that thematic structure you will see in this pathology, that they will be very intensely focused on identifying and characterizing the targeted parent as being an inadequate parent. Now, actually, it's an inadequate spouse, and we'll talk about how it kind of gets loose in their psychological conceptions of who's what and where and things. But in the outward manifestation of it, it's you as you as an inadequate parent, to get their inadequacy out of them and put it on you. And then because of the splitting, you're the abusive parent, they become the all wonderful protective parent and restore their all wonderful idealized image that keeps them out of the black abyss. So both sides of that will be almost to the level of obsessive compulsive. They will be unable to alter their mindsets about either half of that equation, that the targeted parent must be inadequate and they are the wonderful parent. And so while they initially present that narrative, that's where one of the response to interventions can really see this, because if you push on it, you'll see it's very rigid. And that's as I said, obsessive compulsive. I was early on, I was thinking about including the anxiety, obsessive compulsive, because the anxiety drives it, their thinking becomes obsessive. Um, and I was thinking about emphasizing that anxiety component. I haven't, but it's a major driving force for the pathology is anger manage or anxiety management for the pathological parent. But they moved obsessive compulsive disorder out of the anxiety disorders, gave it its own thing. And I didn't want to get too scattered on stuff. But when you do response to interventions on a couple of key points, such as this, the idea that the other parent's inadequate, that's 11, they deserve to be rejected. The other parent's inadequate, and I'm the wonderful parent, that's 2. I'm the protective parent. Uh, that those 2 are very rigidly locked in and are not subject to modification. The Now we know both the narcissist and the borderline will collapse into persecutory delusions. That's just a fact. So this is from Theodore Milan, who's also considered one of the top grand kahunas in personality pathology. He's got the MCMI, Milan multi-axis clinical inventory for personality pathology, considered the gold standard for assessing personalities pathology. And Milan says that under conditions of unrelieved adversity and failure, such as a divorce, narcissists may decompensate into paranoid disorders. So we know that. Owing to their excessive use of fantasy mechanisms, they are disposed to misinterpret events and construct delusional beliefs. Delusional systems may also develop as a result of having felt betrayed and humiliated, again, the divorce, and an arrogant, here we may see the rapid unfolding of persecutory delusions, right there, and an arrogant grandiosity characterized by verbal attacks and bombast. That's pretty much what we're seeing. Verbal attacks and from the narcissist and the grandiose kind of uh, personality pathology. Then from Barno, relative to the borderline personality pathology, this review reveals that psychotic symptoms in borderline personality disorder patients may not predict the development of a psychotic disorder, but are often permanent and severe and need careful consideration by clinicians. So, the psychotic symptoms, the delusion, the persecutory delusion, doesn't reach like a psychotic disorder where they're flamboyant. It's an encapsulated persecutory delusion. It's a persecutory set of belief systems, schemas, internal working models. Uh, and it needs to be considered, the delusional part of that needs to be considered within the treatment of the borderline. Therefore, adequate diagnosis and treatment of psychotic symptoms in borderline personality disorder patients is emphasized. In conclusion, we therefore suggest that it is not a cognitive developmental deficit, but rather a tendency to construe interpersonal relationships as malevolent that characterizes borderline personality disorder. And this may be shared with certain psychotic disorders. So take a look, the malevolent and certain psychotic disorders. So the that ties directly to the American Psychiatric Association definition of a persecutory delusion. That it's a persecutory type, delusions that the person or someone to whom the person is close is being malevolently treated in some way. And the borderline has this belief that they are being malevolently treated in some way. So, what is the certain psychotic disorder they share? A persecutory delusion. So we know what the pathology is with these personalities. One of the problems that the forensic psychologists got into is they came over into the family courts and they didn't want to pathologize people. And the courts and everybody didn't like that parents were accusing each other. You're a narcissist, you're borderline. And they wanted to get away from those labels of the personality disorders that the parents were using to bang on each other. So they said, we're not going to go to those pathology things. We're going to describe, family functioning or something else. They did something different, but that's a problem, um, because if you don't know the pathology, if you don't know that you're dealing with a narcissist and borderline, and you don't know what that is and deal with it, you're in the zone of persecutory delusions, but you don't know that because you're incompetent in working with personality disorders. And so we got attachment, we got delusional thought disorders, personality. They're not competent with personality. They're just lazy and ignorant, and there's no standards over here. So while we don't want to or don't need to diagnose the pathological parent, the problematic parent that's chasing them down the rabbit hole and everybody's accusing each other. We don't need to go there, but we do need to understand what the type of pathology that's coming in from the parents, and what the consequences of that are. So we're going to see persecutory delusions, a shared persecutory delusion. So when we get high conflict custody situations in the court, the differential becomes, is it child abuse by the targeted parent? That's the fears, okay? Or is it a persecutory delusion by the allied parent, and it's creating it in the child a false attachment pathology for secondary gain? And so there's your differential diagnosis. All the time with all the families in the family courts, we should be doing assessments targeting this or looking at this, diagnostic assessments, just routinely. We shouldn't be forcing the targeted parent to get court orders and justify to the court. We know what the pathology is. Let's get it out early on and get an accurate diagnosis that the court can rely on. The concern is child abuse by the targeted parent or by the a live parent, one way or the other. So let's get it out 100% of the time, and let's not put all these hurdles in front of parents and take 6 months, a year, 18 months to get a proper assessment on that. And forensic custody evaluations need to go away. They're bad. So let's talk about the personality side of the pathology. So again, we don't need to diagnose the personality pathology. We just need to understand what it is, because it's going to show up in ripples within the child, uh, and within the family. You're going to see a lot of the patterns and so if you understand the personality, just you'll see all the patterns of it expressing. For example, diagnostic indicator 2 on the diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting, the 5 narcissistic personality traits displayed by a child. You don't see a narcissistic personality disorder in children. And you don't see a child towards a grandiose parent, or a child towards an abusive parent. If this parent's narcissistic and abusing, you don't see the child show a sense of entitlement to that parent. That's a dangerous parent. You don't see the child show a sense of grandiosity where they're judging the adequacy of a dangerous abusive. That's an abusive parent. You don't see the cruelty, absence of empathy where the child's provoking a dangerous parent. So you don't see those symptoms authentically towards an authentically dangerous parent. Um, Haughty and arrogant attitude against if that parent's abusive. No, you don't see that. What those are the fingerprints, psychological fingerprints of control of the child. So you can't psychologically control a child without leaving fingerprints of your control on the child. And those are the narcissistic attitudes of the parent that the child is absorbing because of their enmeshed relationship, their fused psychological state. So it's the allied parent who has the absence of empathy towards the targeted parent and who's cruel. It's the allied parent who has a sense of entitlement that I deserve the child. It's a allied parent who has the haughty and arrogant attitude and the splitting of all good, all bad. I'm the all wonderful parent and you're the all bad parent spouse. And so it's once you recognize that we got an enmeshed relationship, a fused psychological state, then and psychological control of the child, then it becomes very obvious that the child's symptoms are actually being created by the parent. And then what you start to listen for is, are the child's criticisms of the targeted parent a child criticism that we hear typically in that this is what children complain about? My bedtime is, too early, and don't tell me to get off the video game. Or are these complaints about the other parent, the targeted parent, that a spouse would make? And those are the themes. You're too controlling, anger management. You got angry with me, you don't apologize. These are spousal issues. And sometimes the kid will come out, just directly say it. The reason I'm having problems with the targeted parent is because they were mean to mom or they were mean, to dad. So they make it clear that they're in this enmeshed relationship and cross-generational coalition. So the dark personalities, the narcissistic and borderline are diagnostic personality disorders in the DSM-5 diagnostic manual of the DSM of the American Psychiatric Institute. So they have criteria associated. You get five of the criteria, and you qualify or you get the diagnosis of personality disorder. However, there's also the personality disorders are on a spectrum. They're not categorical. So you can have some of the traits or features of a narcissist or borderline or histrionic, and without having all 5 symptoms, without getting up to the criteria of 5 of 9, I think it is 5 of the symptoms needed for a disorder. And what we do on diagnostically at that point is we note it if we want. So in our diagnosis, we would put our main diagnosis, adjustment disorder or something. And then we would note narcissistic personality traits or narcissistic personality features rather than disorder. So we would say it's not up to the criteria, but we're looking at that domain of thing. Now, dark personalities, though, are not diagnostic. They were identified in the research literature. And so they're out of the journals on personality disorder, personality pathology. They're not out of the family court stuff. They're not out of, you know, the, uh, yeah, the family court stuff or attachment or anything. They're um, out of the personality disorder domain. And there's three dark personalities. There's the dark triad, which is narcissism, psychopathic, and Machiavellian levels of manipulation. So narcissism borderlines are extraordinarily manipulative. Dark personalities are at the top. There's nobody more manipulative on the planet than the dark personalities. That's the Machiavellian. That's what I'm, it's like extreme levels of manipulative. So if you're a mental health person or the court, and all of us, and the idea of a parent manipulating the child suddenly emerges as one of the prominent symptoms that you're worried about. If manipulation gets put on the table, then put dark personalities on the table, because that's characteristic, a symptom of that. Narcissism, absence of empathy, that's going to be your cruelty. Psychopathic, that's also going to be your cruelty, externalizing responsibility, failure, self-reflect, and no remorse. Then very manipulative. The dark triad, I'm really good. That's a high spousal abuse one. Let me talk about that for a second. Um, that's when I have a targeted parent mom and a pathological dad, and it moves into the dark triad. It's the addition of that psychopathic component that makes it very dangerous. So it's not just the narcissistic and cruelty and the spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon, and it's the psychopathic level that gets concerning. And then if I have an adolescent child, and particularly an adolescent son relative to the mother, you can get him threatening the mother, and she's calling the police for protection from herself from a son who's kind of threatening and dangerous. That pattern, where if I come in and mom has called the police for protection from her adolescent son, I'm thinking dark triad with the dad and the psychopathic use of the child. Then we have vulnerable dark triad was identified next, which is vulnerable narcissism, the grandiose narcissism. This is vulnerable narcissism, borderline personality pathology, and Machiavellian levels of manipulation. And then if we add sadism to the dark triad, we get the dark tetrad. So that's the most malevolent human on the planet. These dark personalities are, but the dark triad and dark tetrad specifically are extraordinarily malevolent. Think about it. Narcissistic, psychopathic, manipulative, and sadistic. Yeah, that's pretty bad. And that's who we have in the family courts. Okay. We have this in the family courts because it's in the population. We know that, and they're highly conflicted people. They create a lot of conflict in situations, and they're using manipulating the court system to get custody of the child and to abuse the other parent by creating pathology in the child. There's your Machiavellian levels of manipulation that move it into a factitious disorder imposed on the child for secondary gain to the parent. And so this is an organized constellation of pathology that, no matter how you look at it, attachment, family systems, personality disorder, you open it up and look at the 12 associated clinical signs, no matter how you look at it, you're going to be finding the exact thing, because there's something here. And it's not being addressed in the family courts. Oh my goodness. And that's an extraordinary problem relative to these dark personalities. So just a description of a dark triad. First cited by Paul Hoos and Williams, the dark triad refers to a set of three distinct but related antisocial personality traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Each of the dark triad traits is associated with feelings of superiority and privilege. This, coupled with a lack of remorse and empathy, often leads these individuals high in these socially malevolent traits to exploit others for their own personal gain. And they are manipulating the courts. They're here. And that's where the court system, with the support of mental health, we need to get better mental health information to the courts. But then the courts need to get a handle on this type of pathology and being manipulated by it. Right. And the I want to emphasize the importance of this, because it's child abuse, it's spousal abuse, it's active, nobody's doing anything about it, and it's going on for years, and it's pretty brutal. The dark personalities have been identified as the core of evil in the research literature. Okay, so Book and Visser, Unpacking Evil, claiming the core of the dark triad personality. Look at the journal, Personality and Individual Differences. This is not the family court literature. This is out of the real stuff on personality disorder. This is real research on real personality stuff. And they're called, and I was kind of surprised as I'm reading through the research literature, and I come across articles that say we think we found where evil is and what evil is. And like, whoa. And yeah, I agree. This is the core of evil. And then Book and the colleagues again, Unpacking More Evil. What is at the core of the dark tetrad? That's an addition of sadism. So yeah, this pathology in the family courts is about as nasty as you can get, about as bad as you can get. And that's an issue for the mental health people who are treating this. Don't come here if you don't know what you're doing. This is the most difficult pathology to work with. Personality disorder, narcissistic borderline personality, activated around the child, and they're manipulating because it's part of their own psychology, and they're very vengeful and retaliatory, and they're very manipulative. And this is not someplace you come if you're a master, licensed professional counselor and you're doing therapy in the family courts. No, you need to know what you're doing. That's why I recommend, as the targeted parents seek out to clinical psychology, and who do I get into as clinical psychologists, is for the moms, I recommend the intimate partner violence, domestic violence therapists and community therapists, because they'll recognize the patterns of the narcissistic dad. For the dad targeted parents, I recommend looking at dialectic behavior therapists, because they'll recognize the borderline patterns of the borderline mom. But if you can't find one or the other, you can cross over. But both of those domains of therapists out there are working with personality pathology. So the intimate partner violence, domestic violence therapists, the real ones, not the DV monkeys, but the real ones, they're working with narcissistic personality and dangerous pathology, spousal abuse, and protecting, getting the mom or into the shelter with her kids and stuff. So they're not afraid of personality disorders, and they're not afraid of dangerous pathology. And over on the DBT folks, they're working with the borderlines who are suicidal and delusional, and they're going to be making board complaints and manipulative. And so they're not afraid of the personality disorders either, or dangerous pathology, the suicidality of the border. So you got the strong enough therapists from the proper field to be able to deal with the personality disorder pathology that we have in the family courts. But that's a level of understanding about the personality pathology. And it's useful because if we have a narcissist personality, I may only see two of the symptoms, but if the moment I kind of recognize I'm in this pattern, I can look for the other ones and say, oh yeah, there they are. Okay, there. And so understanding the personality pathology helps us understand the patterns, because that's what diagnostic criteria are. They're the patterns. And so they're meeting the patterns of the pathology. Um, but it's not helpful for treatment. It's helpful for diagnosis, not helpful for treatment. Puts us in the ballpark of treatment. The personality disorders, and we know that they're going to have problems processing sadness. It's going to get turned over to angry, and they're collapsing into delusional, persecutory delusion. So it helps with treatment by giving us kind of the domain that we're in. But really, when we get to working with it, it's more helpful for treatment to actually frame the personality pathology as to what it more accurately is, which is the trauma in the attachment networks, unresolved trauma in attachment networks. And so that'll help us understand where it is and how to get it out. And the trauma reenactment narrative is critical to understand with this pathology, because that's what we have here. It's a reenactment of their childhood trauma in the current family relationships. Freud called it the transference. Beck calls it schemas. Bowlby calls it internal working models. Van der Kolk calls it a trauma reenactment. Trauma people, that's what our phrase is, trauma reenactment narrative. And and it's in a pattern. The trauma pattern is victimized child, abusive parent, protected parent. That's your trauma pattern. And what they're doing, the pathological parent is doing, is they are mimicking the authentic trauma pattern to fool other people, factitious disorder, to manipulate other people by being a mimic of the actual abuse trauma pattern. So trauma reenactment, Van der Kolk describes it. When the the childhood trauma fails to be integrated into the totality of the person's life experiences, the victim remains fixated on the trauma. Despite avoidance of emotional involvement, traumatic memories cannot be avoided. Even when pushed out of waking consciousness, they come back in the form of reenactments, nightmares, or feelings related to the trauma. That's the anxiety. Reoccurrences may continue throughout the lifespan during periods of stress, like divorce. So you're going to see this activated into these trauma reenactments, or the transference of the childhood trauma to the current relationship, particularly around divorce. Goes on to say, another article, victims of trauma respond to contemporary stimuli as if the trauma had returned, without conscious awareness that the past injury, rather than the current stress, is the basis for their physiological emergency responses. So what happens here, and this is important to understand, is the attachment networks are the brain system for love and bonding that mediate all aspects of love and bonding throughout the lifespan, including grief and loss, So when there's the divorce, the attachment system goes warm to mediate that the problem in love and bonding and the grief associated with it. And then they can't process the grief, so it gets all kind of squirrely in there. But when that trauma from childhood rises with the internal working models of their activated attachment system, the past injury, rather than the current stress, is the basis of their physiological activity, their anxiety activation. That's what trauma is. It's an anxiety activation. So they get its anxiety, and then they're trying to attribute, why am I anxious? There's nothing in the current world that should make them anxious, but they're anxious. They know they're anxious because they feel it, and it's a trauma anxiety. And so then, what's anxiety signal? Some sort of danger. Danger to who? Am I No, I'm divorcing him. I'm not in danger. But there's a danger to the child. The anxiety has something about danger to the child. It must be this child. They're abusive to this child. And all of a sudden, down they go down the rabbit hole of constructing the narrative. The hyperarousal interferes with their ability to make calm and rational assessments, and prevents their resolution and integration of the trauma. So yeah, it's their anxiety activates, and it's a misattribution of anxiety for them. I'm anxious from the unresolved trauma, but I think it's the current situation, and anxiety signals danger, and it's about the child. I need to protect the child, and it's the child who's being abused, and oh, there we get the trauma reenactment narrative on it. For the child, it's a misattribution of the grief response, because the divorce and the whole family breakup activates sadness and grief. But under the guidance and manipulative psychological control of the pathological parent, the child is led into believing that the hurt from the grief and loss is because the other parent did bad things to you. That's that whole Kernberg quote about interpreting sadness as anger and resentment, loaded with revengeful wishes. That's what we see in the child: anger and resentment loaded with revengeful wishes against the targeted parent, because they're being influenced by the psychological structure of the narcissistic borderline dark parent. But for the child, that sadness is an authentic thing. Okay, so they do hurt, and they hurt with the targeted parent because they want to bond to that parent. They're not bonding, so that means their grief goes up. When they're over with the allied parent, their motivation to bond to the target parent goes down, their grief goes down, so they hurt less. So the child recognizes that they have this differential between, I hurt more with the targeted parent, I hurt less with the allied parent, but it has to do with the grief response and sadness. And once we get the sadness processed out and the rebonding back again, everything's fine. And so the child is misattributing sadness and grief under the influence of the pathological parent who can't process sadness and grief. And the allied parent is misattributing anxiety from their reactivated. So at a core, we have misattributions of emotions, and it's the misattribution of anxiety that is the persecutory delusion. Do you see that? That it's not a psychotic disorder. It's that the anxiety elevates when the attachment networks get activated around divorce. Their trauma rises with that and reactivates their anxiety. Then they interpret their anxiety as being some sort of danger to the child, and that's not true. There is no danger to the child. It's from their past. And there's your delusional disorder. That's your persecutory delusion. That's the source of it. From Perlman and Cortese, reenactments of the traumatic past are common in the treatment of this population, trauma patients, and frequently represent either explicit or coded representations or repetitions of the unprocessed trauma in an attempt at mastery. So let me emphasize that for a second. That's what the brain is doing with these trauma reenactments, and even with the intrusive symptoms of PTSD. But it's with the trauma reenact, it's reenacting, repeating that unresolved experience with an attempting to process it through, attempting to get mastery of their vulnerability and trauma experience of childhood. And that's why not only do we get a repetition of features, of patterns, we also get specific corrective effects. That's ACS2 is a corrective effect. That I'm the protective parent is a critical one. That the allied parent as a child going through their trauma, whatever it was, did not have anybody to protect them. In this current reenactment, the child themselves as a child has a protector, the allied parent, and so that role is critical. And boy, that's the one that you push on it a little bit on a response to intervention, and you'll see it is just locked in there. They must be the protective parent, and if they must be the protective parent, that means they need an abusive parent to protect the child from. And so the targeted parent must be malevolently treating the child in some way. And no amount of information will change that belief system. your delusion. No amount of, despite contrary evidence, because they're working through their own trauma patterns and they don't realize it. They think it's real, they think it's now. That's your psychotic, out of touch with reality thing. It's an encapsulated persecutory delusion from the collapse of a narcissistic, borderline dark personality parent. The Perlman and Curtis reenactments can be expressed psychologically, relationally, and somatically, and it may occur with conscious intent or little awareness. So, people say, hey, is it a factitious disorder, shared delusion? It's kind of both, kind of in a gray zone between a delusional disorder and a factitious intentional causing of the situation. From Perlman and Cortese again, one primary transference countertransference dynamic. So they're transferring trauma and we're responding to their narrative. Our countertransference dynamic involves reenactment of familiar roles of victim, perpetrator, rescuer, bystander. So those are your classic four roles in the trauma reenactment. Trauma people, we know this. We know there's these roles to the trauma. We know there's a bystander role to the trauma. Does any forensic psychologist know that? Does any forensic psychologist know they're in the bystander role? Does anyone realize that the bystander role in clinical practice when out in the field is called the betrayer, the one who should protect and doesn't? Okay, you, the forensic mental health people, in courts, in GALs, and all, you're in the bystander role, the one who should protect and doesn't. Okay, the betrayer. That's when trauma when we come in. Typically, that's a mom in the sex abuse cases. She sacrifices a child to the stepdad, to their new husband to save the marriage, or to the father to save the marriage. So she's in the betrayer role, the bystander role. And our treatment oftentimes is to activate her into her protective role for authentic child abuse. So they act out the victim, perpetrator, rescuer, bystander in the therapeutic relationship. Therapist and client play out these roles often in complementary fashion with one another as they relive various aspects of the client's early attachment relationships. That is exactly spot on what's happening here. People are in this family are reliving various aspects of the allied parents' early childhood attachment relationships. It's a trauma reenactment, and that's what makes it a delusional pathology, out of touch with reality, because they're responding to current events as if they were past events, as if they were living in the past. So this is a little diagram I put together to help explain it, because I kind of think visually. So when the divorce happens, it activates two sets of representational networks in the attachment system of the narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. One is from the past relationships, the unresolved trauma, and that's in the pattern of victimized child, abusive parent, protective parent from their own childhood. And then they get another set of representations for the current child and the targeted parent and the allied parent, the current people. And what happens with these two sets is they become fused into one because they're both active at the same time. Their past trauma patterns are active at the same time, a concurrent activation of two sets of representational networks in the attachment system of the narcissistic borderline dark personality parent creates a fusion of they're psychologically equivalent. The current child is me as the child. The targeted parent is my abusive parent, and I'm now the protective parent who can protect me as a child from my abusive parent, but they don't realize that that's the pattern being imposed, and it's just become victimized child, abusive parent, protective parent, when in truth it's just parent, child, parent. There's no victimization, there's no abuse, there's no that's all. And there's your persecutory delusion. That's where it comes from. It's a trauma origin delusion, unresolved trauma. That's why, in my opinion, when this gets back, people, 5, 10 years after I'm gone, when you get to putting this back in the DSM-5, 5 point whatever, 5.2 or 6.0 or whatever, when you get it back in the DSM, it should go back in as that shared psychotic disorder that was in the DSM-4 TR, a shared delusional disorder, shared person, but it should be moved over to the trauma section as a transgenerational trauma, understanding the all of this, and you bring all the research in on the transference and trauma reenactment, and it's a strong, I think, a strong case to bring back the shared psychotic disorder into a next revision of the DSM-5, move it over to the trauma section, and as a transgenerational transmission of trauma. So, in what happens in the psychological equivalency is we basically get the targeted parent becomes the abusive parent, the current child becomes a victimized child, and the narcissistic borderline parent becomes the protective parent in this situation. Now, none of that's true, though. The targeted parent isn't abusive, the current child isn't victimized, and the narcissistic borderline parent isn't a protective parent. So that's the psychotic, um, out of touch with reality kind of situation off of that. The And so with that, I'm going to wrap up on my discussion of the pathological parent. One of the features that I would close with to help or reorient targeted parents to working with their ex is that both the narcissist and the borderline present as very dangerous and very powerful, especially the narcissist. But they're both very dangerous. Dark personality, very dangerous. And so people who interact with them see them as powerful, and we are trying to cope with their power. That's not actually true. They are actually very fragile people. They're just on the edge of collapsing into dysfunctional places. And they are so dysfunctional that they get overwhelmed with your power. You're not capable, you're competent, you are loved, you're a normal range human. They're not. They know they have damage and they're barely getting along. And the only way they can get along relative to the power dynamic in this and keeping out of that dark place of I'm rejected, I'm inadequate, no one's ever going to love me, I'm just awful human, and collapsing into that black hole of their damage. In order to keep out of that, they have to get the child to reject you so that you become the rejected parent, you become the inadequate parent, and project that vulnerability out onto you. And so they need to make, they're not strong at all, they're just basically collapsing down. And when this personality pathology attacks, it triggers us to respond with attack, to defensive, and to respond with power relative to the power that they're displaying. But they're displaying false power. This is a pathology of lies. I keep saying that. Everything about this is a lie. And so they're displaying as powerful when they're really very vulnerable and weak. And we respond to the power that makes the vulnerable and weak part even more afraid because we're so powerful. And so just that helps to understand as we come into resolving this is that we're dealing with a fragile and weak person. Final thing I'll close on is contingent visitation schedule. And I think getting the structure on these personality pathology is important, and understanding that in order to resolve the child loves both parents, and we want to bond that child to both parents, even the pathological parent. And so helping that bond when you have a psychologically abusive parent is helping the parent deal with the causes, which is the unresolved trauma and whatever happened there, and their own activation into abandonment, rejection kinds of things, and helping that parent because the child is taking care of that parent. And so if we're going to ask the child to stop taking care of that, somebody has to. So that's the mental health team. So that we should be stepping up and helping that parent work through their childhood trauma because they're a child abuse survivor. And we need to kind of reorient how we think about things. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday. And good luck, everybody, and take care.